Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Today's episode is about one of the biggest economic challenges facing the United States. For too many people, and in almost every imaginable aspect of American society, the cost of living, and therefore the cost of almost everything, has grown way too high. My guest today is Gary Winslett of the Chamber of Progress and Middlebury College, and we discuss how not only do we have to deal with the 2021 plus spike in inflation, but the broader story over how the past several decades, the cost of anything you could imagine from manufacturing and childcare to healthcare, housing, and infrastructure has increased at a rate which has prevented us from building the type of world we want to actually live in. In this conversation, we cover his new report on how we can address the cost of living crisis via supply-side progressivism, and of course, something this podcast is very interested in, the overall abundance agenda. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Hope you all enjoy and gain something from this conversation. Gary Winslett, welcome to the Realignment.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Excited to chat with you. We're going to hit a bunch of different topics, but I think we should start with some wonky news the audience can use. There was a bunch of big permitting reform legislation passed in Congress this week. That seems to be super niche, not particularly relevant, but can you just start by explaining what permitting reform is and why anyone who's attracted to this topic should be incredibly excited about what's happened?
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, we had the Chips and Sciences Act, which is about promoting semiconductor manufacturing in the United States, right? There's a whole reason geopolitically competing with China, but also to promote technology that we want semiconductors built in the United States. But the problem is because the government would be helping to finance those, that immediately triggers those being considered major federal actions under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Okay, well, that means that being a major federal action and triggering that means you got to get what's called an EIS, or an environmental impact statement. Those can take a long time. They average 4.5 years. They can go up to 7 or 8. They expose the project to all kinds of litigation. There's all kinds of extra rules. It takes forever. It's really cumbersome. Well, that's a huge problem if we're trying to quickly ramp up semiconductor production. And so what Congress did this week, and it's bipartisan legislation, the Senate sponsors were Mark Kelly and Ted Cruz. In the House, it had, 2-to-1 support. It needed to pass by 2/3. It had 79 Democrats on it, a bunch of Republicans. They passed the Build Chips in America Act, which basically says that by itself, the government helping to finance these semiconductor fabs, these manufacturing facilities, don't automatically make that a major federal action. So by themselves, you're not triggering that like 4.5 year super paperwork blockage before you can even start anything. And so this is what we call permitting reform, right? There's a whole bunch of areas in American society where we need to be better at building things, whether that's semiconductors or wind turbines or houses or daycare centers or rural hospitals. We're not as good at building things right now as we should be. And part of that, not the only thing, but part of that is our permitting system. And so getting permitting reform right is a really big deal. And there's been a couple of others right behind it. Yesterday, you had this new permitting reform in forestry management to help prevent wildfires. You also had a permitting reform bill sponsored by AOC that's really going to help out geothermal. And so this is a thing that I think really can be bipartisan. There's a lot of political topics which will inescapably be partisan. I don't think permitting reform, housing abundance, making sure everybody can afford childcare, green energy, lowering healthcare costs. These things don't have to be partisan. And so it's been really thrilling to see these last couple of days, this sort of bipartisan energy around permitting reform come around.
Two things. So number one, I think what's so exciting about the bipartisanship that's emerged around permitting reform is that there's a kind of bad, mushy version of bipartisanship, which is basically like, look, let's just sort of meet in the middle, semi-arbitrarily. It's the 2010s. We're basically reciting 5 different David Brooks or Thomas Friedman columns in the New York Times. But what's exciting about this is it's ambitious. It's accomplishing something, because I think the idea is so rooted in practical, broad shared objectives, you could actually accomplish something without just having to say, oh, we're just bipartisan because we're pretending there aren't trade-offs or there aren't other like value juxtapositions. So I'd love to hear your response to that.
So yeah, so this is one of those areas where I think you've got to actually not just think big picture, but have the ability to like get into the weeds and the details. I mean, this is part of what I do as part of my research. My first book was on regulatory trade barriers, which sounds super niche and picayune, but they affect everything we buy and sell and how people make money. But if you go into these details, you can actually get a lot of traction in terms of doing practical things that help people out. So something like minimum lot sizes. That sounds like something that's going to be super detailed, almost boring in these like local zoning codes. But the thing about minimum lot sizes is they kill starter homes. If you're telling people they have to build on a full acre, well, then a developer's only going to build big stuff because they have to have the full acre of space. Whereas if you have smaller minimum lot sizes, the way that like Houston does, you can build those smaller starter homes. Well, guess what? That's good for young men who want to work in construction. Now they have more job opportunities. That's good for young families who maybe don't have a lot of money, but would love to get, out of their parents' basement, right? That's good for seniors who want to downsize. They want to stay in their community, but now all of a sudden, they don't have kids in the house anymore. The house is just too big for them. They're getting older. They want a single level place, right? Instead of stairs, but they don't want to go to a nursing home. They want to live independent. Well, a starter home helps with that, right? But that's about minimum lot sizes. And so to me, what I really want to do in my work is connect these details that matter a lot with these big problems we're trying to solve. And so that's why I can often try to do things like permitting reform, like minimum lot sizes, and some of the other stuff we'll talk about today.
The second thing I want to get to, and I think this permitting reform concept makes something that my friend of the show, Stephen Telles of Johns Hopkins and Niskanen really talks about, which is the permitting reforms that we need to pass emerged out of like the post-war 1960s, 1970s period, where if you are a legislator, if you are a person interested in policy, if we're looking at the problem we're trying to solve, it's that like in the 60s and 70s, we were probably in different categories, especially relating to the environment, doing too much. There was too much pollution. Mm-hmm. There wasn't enough
the Cuyahoga River caught on fire like 5 times.
That's a real thing, right? Like we're focused on Cincinnati or Cleveland in that case. So I think what's so relevant here is that unlike the 60s and 70s, the problem is not that we're building too much and we need to then find ways to constrain that. The issue now is the pendulum is swung in the other direction and we're not able to actually do the things we actually want to do. So can you speak to that shift in framework and mentality? But I think especially, frankly, as a child of the 1990s, so much of my political education was focused more on the like, we need to restrain and not do things, but we now need to focus on actually doing things.
Yeah. So I grew up playing football. I played, first grade through 12th grade. And sometimes in football, you're on defense and sometimes you're on offense. And that 60s, 70s mentality is really like a defense mentality. Let's stop bad things from happening. And that's I'm not here to knock that in its context for its day. We didn't have a Clean Water Act at a certain point. We didn't have a Clean Air Act. We didn't have an EPA, right? We, didn't have the Montreal Protocol that helped reverse the hole in the ozone layer in the 80s. There's a lot of things we just didn't have. We had smog in California, mentioned the Cuyahoga River. There's all kinds of reasons we were playing defense then. But that's not the problem we have now. Now we got the ball. We're on offense. And so what we need to do is build things. You got to build green energy. You got to make sure that those wind turbines actually can go up instead of be stuck forever in permitting, right? You've got to actually make sure that you have cheap, clean, abundant electricity to be able to unlock everything else. So there's a new form of steel manufacturing called molten oxide electrolysis, which basically uses a whole ton of electricity to make steel in a zero carbon way. But it's only zero carbon if the electricity itself is green electricity. So in order to do that, you need huge amounts of green energy. Well, where's that going to be? That's going to be in the places where you can build that green energy. So if we're thinking about the manufacturing of tomorrow, because people care a lot about manufacturing in the United States, really wanting to build here, well, that's going to need to be built next to and on top of green energy resources. And so that's why just one of many examples of what I mean by playing offense. We need to build now. We need to be, an environmentalism that builds, a society that builds.
all of the topics we're discussing today broadly fit under what folks such as yourself refer to as the abundance agenda. The abundance agenda is a pretty new entrant to the post-2016, we're rethinking our approach to economics and politics and policy. So for listeners who aren't aware of this topic, which we've been covering more on the show recently, can you just give your definition of the abundance agenda and speak to why it resonates with you?
So it resonates to me because it's about actually solving the problem rather than just like feeling good about it. There's a way in which I sort of juxtapose the abundance agenda and being like a build orientation against like a blame orientation. So like if you listen to JD Vance or Donald Trump, they're just always blaming immigrants. It like doesn't matter what the issue itself is. It's always like blame a foreigner, blame an immigrant. You get a little bit of this on the left sometimes where there is a certain part of the left that's knee-jerk reaction. You just blame corporations. It doesn't matter what the problem is. It's just like blame a big business. But that's not actually the source of a lot of these shortage problems. It's not a developer's fault that we don't have enough housing. Like the enemy of the renter is not a landlord. The enemy of the renter is the invisible graveyard of housing developers wanted to build and couldn't. And so to me, the abundance agenda is about being the society that builds, but as importantly, it's really about bringing down cost of living, because that's actually what most people on the street care about. Like if you go talk to people about an abundance agenda, people like you and me, we're like all excited about it. But like if you go talk to like regular folks, they're just annoyed and upset that everything costs so much. Like if you looked at just context free, a chart of wages over the last 25, 30 years, it actually looks pretty good, right? Median wage used to be about $10 an hour. And if you look at the most recent Bureau of Labor Statistics data, the median wage in the United States is $35 an hour. Wages are pretty good. I mean, I don't want to say nobody's struggling. I'm not here to invalidate people, but I'm just saying.
But if we just took a graph and said, look, here's the trend line. Why is everyone pissed off? This is great.
Right. Well, they're pissed off for a reason, and they're justified to be pissed off because everything is too expensive. Right. If you ask me what the story of the political economy is right now, it's people who worked their behinds off to get that raise, to get that promotion, and then saw all of that wage gain eaten by things being too expensive. And so to me, the abundance agenda is not just about building for building's sake, but about making things more affordable for middle class and working class Americans. And that's housing, because that's too expensive. That's childcare. That's too expensive. Energy and infrastructure bleeds into everything else. So it's about that too. Even middle class people, they get really worried about what would happen to their finances if they got sick. So it's also about bringing down healthcare costs. And so to me, that's where I would take the abundance agenda is like, yes, I love the vibes of building, but it's not just for its own sake. It's for making things more affordable for people.
The point of building is so that we have more supply. And if we have more supply, the costs in the areas we're interested in will actually, or should actually go down. And I think what's also so attractive about the abundance agenda and just the actual focus on the cost of living and the actual, like unironically to borrow a term from the left, like the lived experience of actual voters and people who live here in this country is it actually gives us a rubric by which we can measure, are we succeeding? So if it turns, and this is, I think, why YIMBYism has gotten a bunch of wins recently, building more housing, et cetera. If it turns out that increasing the supply of housing, making it easier for developers to build more housing isn't actually reducing the pricing, then there's an actual empirical thing we could fight about. This is an actually testable theory versus sort of like the vibes-based version that makes it sort of difficult to actually correct and rejigger the policy approach we're taking.
Yep.
I'd say the thing I'd really be interested in hearing from you around, because what's so great about your cost of living agenda paper that we're going to get into in a few minutes is you're combining political policy analysis with this specific agenda point that you're hitting here. So this paper is really written for, if let's just say you're a up and coming politician who's trying to find the next thing, the first 5 or 6 pages are going to be great for you because the point of it is, look, we have these wonky niche things we could do with childcare, and then there's this permitting reform thing, but here is the broad rubric for understanding today's political moment. So if I were to juxtapose what I'm seeing as a person who's a generalist in this field and just surveys narratives, I think of the 2010s, the centerpiece is really about income inequality. It's this post-2008, post 2016 story where you just saw very, very aggressively at a narrative level, folks say, hey, if you are a center-left politician, if you are a right-wing populist, both ends of the spectrum here, you should be organizing your thought around the fact that all these wage and economic gains have gone to one sort of people and not the other sort of person. I'm not trying to diminish that, but I do think we're seeing this interesting transition purely from focusing on that narrative to focusing then instead on this question of supply, costs, et cetera. From your perspective as an economist, can you speak to the juxtaposition of income inequality and then the supply side of these things? And are these incompatible? Are they different? Are they the same? Am I creating a false dichotomy?
Yeah. So first of all, just a quick correction so I don't get accused of misrepresenting myself. I'm actually a political scientist, not an economist. I do research in international political economy, but I'm a political scientist. Just for clarification, what I would say is that there actually is an equity aspect to this. So I like to think about it as like musical chairs. We all remember musical chairs when we were a kid. Not enough chairs for the kids. And so the kid who's a little slower, or maybe he's got a broken ankle, like they don't have a chair. They're just out. Like makes for a fun game when you're in the third grade. But like in actual American society, that's bad. Like we don't want there to be these people getting left behind in all kinds of ways. Like that's the thing to me that sticks to me from the 2010s. Is it just like inequality in a vague sense, but it's people feeling that they have been left behind, that there is not a chair in American society for them. And so to me, what the solution is just like build more chairs. Like if you build more chairs, then that actually helps people at the bottom. We have, and it's not just hypothetical, we have lots of good data and evidence on this from places like the Federal Reserve, the American Economic Review, the top journal in economics. We have these things called chains of moves. And so if you build a new unit of housing, even if it's $500,000, what that does is that it allows somebody who maybe isn't, like working class, but they earn a $420,000 home. They can move into that. Now their 420 home is open to somebody else. That goes to somebody who's currently in a 350 home. Well, now that 350 home is open and somebody can move into that from a townhouse all the way on down. And so when you create abundance, you actually do help the people at the bottom the most because they're the ones who get squeezed by the shortage the hardest. When there's a shortage, it's not wealthy people who get left out. Like the fastest kid always is going to get the chair, even if there's only one or two. It's the people at the bottom who get hurt the most. And so to me, it actually is about fixing inequality too.
Another word that comes up in your report that I think is incredibly relevant is the word normal. Because if I were to diagnose the political moment, I would say, and we're seeing this on the left and on the right, the 2010s post-2008 period was one where I think there was a reasonable thesis that voters were demanding a revolution. That's not just sort of a slight on Bernie. They were demanding. So this isn't just Bernie was a part of this, but there's also a broader picture here, which is like, look, people are pissed off. People see all the ways that the world is wrong. And therefore, the answer to that is aggression. The answer is scope. The answer is blame in the case, once again, of, the Biden administration's approach to inflation. You can talk about greedflation, you talk about corporations, but I just have been struck that recently that just hasn't been working with voters, either the left-wing version or the right-wing version. So what I think is attractive about the way you're framing the abundance agenda is that there's just something straightforward and normal about it, but I think meets the political moment. So now we correctly have identified you as a political scientist. Can you speak to this dynamic and the degree in which you've detected that, or whether you disagree with me, that's open too?
No, I think that's right. And I think it's because Donald Trump is so exhausting. I think that, when he came onto the scene in 2015, that anger, that rage is new and it feels kind of fresh. It's different. You've not seen anything like this before. And even early in his presidency, it's still like relatively new. Like we're going on close to a decade of him being just like in your face all the time. And I think that after a while, that just gets exhausting. Like anger for a little bit is energizing, but after a while, it's just all the time. And so I think that's part of it, actually, is just people being tired of Donald Trump's antics. And that just just constant negativity. Anger is one of those things that done selectively and done strategically can be really effective. It can make people feel like they're being heard. It can make people feel like their pain is being listened to and felt. But after a while, it's clear that it's more an act, or it's more like a personality pathology. So I think that's part of it. I also think that, in terms of the job market, we're not where we were in 2014, 2013. The recovery from the recession outside of a couple of superstar cities took forever. Everybody had the 2008, 2009, 2010 recession. Our superstar cities recovered pretty quickly. They were back to where they were 2012, 2013. They're feeling pretty good. Lots of rural and ex-urban places did not feel like they had a recovery. So if you look at the Economic Innovation Group had a really cool report that came out in 2016, and they pointed out that from 2010 to 2014, there was no net increase in business establishments in the most rural counties. So what we mean by that is that if you look at sort of recovery as, are there new businesses getting created versus closing? There's no recovery in rural America in 2010 to 2014. Of course they were outraged. Of course they were furious, right? Like, how could you not be? But there's actually been a pretty decent recovery after that across both the Trump and the Biden administrations. That recovery from the 2008 financial crisis took too long, but it did happen over time. And so now that we're at a place where we have 4.2% unemployment, where a lot of our economic growth is happening in places like North Carolina, like Georgia, like Texas, like in more of these rural ex-urban areas, people are less instinctively pissed off, and they're more just frustrated at cost of living being too high.
And I'll echo your Donald Trump exhaustion comment. I think the exhaustion framework is actually a very, very helpful one. I just generally think if we were to diagnose the American political condition, it would just be exhaustion on, once again, and this affects both sides of the aisle here. This isn't just sort of a Donald Trump dunk session, but I also think the left side of the table ends up running into the problem of, at the end of the day, like their response to 2014, 2015, 2016, they never solved the actual electoral part of that, which is there are no congressional majorities in favor of massive wealth redistribution as just this like top-down approach. Like you could think that like Jeff Bezos and, Elon Musk are the source of America's problems and how all of like the globalization gains going to them created this huge problem. But at the end of the day, you've had 10 years to make the political case that advancing that is the key way to do it. And it just didn't work. I think for good faith and bad faith reasons. And then the other problem too is it couldn't win Democratic presidential primaries. So we just have ended up in this space where the 2010s approach has just run into narrative political limitations, but also just very, very practical ones. So once again, that's why I started on the bipartisan side of things with this episode, not in an annoying sort of aged 20th century, Tip O'Neill and the Gipper used to get beer together, two Irishmen. Why can't we do that? Like that's kind of cringe and not even helpful as a metaphor. The actual point here is abundance agenda ideas have a theory of the case for how they could actually advance in an incredibly divided country. And I think any political movement, left, right, or center, has to start there. Okay, so let's get to the actual report here. So despite, and this is the key thing, what I love about what you said earlier is you haven't done the thing of basically saying there are no villains and there are no bad actors. Like there's no problem. We're all just great. Like why can't everyone just be happy? You do start by saying there is actually a great villain in America's economy today, and that is the cost of living. So you've kind of stated this earlier, but just like in a real, not even succinct, you would answer this as long as you want to give, but basically like, why should we identify high cost of living as the central thing we are fighting against in this country today?
Because that's what voters tell us they care about. Like, that's it. Like, that's the answer. You listen to voters. And voters say that this is what annoys them, and this is just what they don't like, and this is what they want policy to alleviate.
And now, a quick word about the A16Z podcast. Hey, it's Marshall. In an exponential era, it's more important than ever for our country to have alignment between policymakers, founders, and funders. However, it's rare that we find them all in the same room. That's where the A16Z podcast from Andreessen Horowitz comes in. They bring together guests like the very first CTO of the CIA and the chief security officers behind OpenAI, Anthropic, and DeepMind to cover topics like intelligence in the era of AI, the nuclear renaissance, the future of defense, and much more in the world of American dynamism. The term coined by A16Z general partner and friend of the Realignment, Catherine Boyle. The A16Z podcast's episodes also tackle other important trends in technology and business, from supply chains to space and beyond. Want to know more about the 3 billion record Social Security breach? They've got you covered. Wondering if tech can finally disrupt the healthcare industry? They recently broke this down. Curious about governing democracy, corporate boards, and the internet? Listen in to find out. Eavesdrop on the future with the A16Z podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now. And I think the key thing here that comes from that too is, as you know, issue-based polling is incredibly frustrating and I think actually like not only unhelpful from a, hey, I'm a political actor or I'm a staffer on the Hill or I'm a voter, how should I understand things? I think issue-based polling is really, 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 really misleading. There are a lot of, people on the Democratic Socialist left who see polls saying that 2/3 of Americans want Medicare for all. Well, if that's not happening, it means that, the system's corrupt and everything's broken, when what it actually means is that's a very misleading poll, which doesn't actually helpfully discern what's happening here. But
it's
I just like
extremely finicky based upon how you word questions.
Yeah. If you give everyone, for example, with that Medicare for All poll, which I looked into after every single listener who was mad at me for dismissing Medicare for All as an actual policy way forward, if you actually look at the way the phrasing is, it basically gets rid of all of the costs. It gets rid of all of the trade-offs. It just frames it like, would you like to have universal health care? And sort of like, okay, sure. Yeah. If you frame it that way, of course, people are going to say yes to it. But my point is, what's helpful about starting with the high cost of living as just the empirical thing that voters are ticked off about is it offers an order of operations for folks who might not have their policy areas in that space. So let's say you're a climate activist. You should not be spending your time trying to nichely word polls in ways that say, well, actually, it turns out that climate anxiety is the number one thing affecting Gen Zs and millennials. And no, what you should think about is look, voters care about inflation. They care about the cost of living. How do we fit our already existing agenda into that area? And you said this earlier when you said, hey, green energy is going to play a huge role in actually handling this situation. But I'd love for you to talk about how, if we have this rubric of high cost of living, how should we then take other areas and fit that into that?
Yeah. So I think climate and energy is a great one. So there are lots of people out there who they don't roll coal and do the big trucks kind of thing, but they're also very skeptical of the idea that climate action will force them to sacrifice. They don't want to do that. But if you can be like, hey, actually, these solar panels on your roof not only are good for the environment, they're going to bring down your electricity cost, particularly in summer when you really want to run the AC. That's a winning message. There's lots of people in the broad American center who are totally up for climate action if it's creating good jobs and bringing down their cost of living. And so that's how I would bring that into it. Right. And if you think about something like childcare, right, it's really expensive. And this is one of these areas where I feel like there's an opportunity for Democrats to talk about this like normal people. JD Vance can't help but be weird and aggressive and kind of mean, calling people like childless cat ladies. There's not a universe in which Jesus Christ would have ever used childless cat lady as a cruel taunt. The right can just go weird with this kind of stuff. But actually, if you look at different kinds of polling, people say that they want more children than they're actually having. And the number one reason they're not having as many children as they'd like is because raising children is really expensive. So, okay, how do we actually address that? Well, one of the things that we talk about in this cost of living report that I work for Chamber of Progress is you do want to do some spending, right? Universal school lunches is great. It helps students stay focused. There's less stigma when everybody's getting free school lunch. It's not that expensive. Government's getting huge bang for the buck there. But you also want to do things like make sure that your local and state zoning are making it impossible to build new daycare centers, which in some states is true. You also want to make sure that it's easier to provide in-home childcare. You also want to do things like an expanded child tax credit. This is something that me and Patrick T. Brown, who's a social conservative, we totally agree on, that there should be a bigger child tax credit because that helps families who want to send children to daycare, but also who want to have one parent stay home, right? There's all these ways in which you can practically think about, okay, how do we reduce cost of raising children, and that being able to help people have the number of children they want. Because if people want children and they don't have them because they can't afford them, like that's heartbreaking in a certain kind of way. And I just think there's a duty to try to do something to help people along those lines, and that's about cost of living. And so I that's how I would bring that one in there as well.
Yeah, and look, like I'm, in the prepping to be a dad section of things, and from a practical perspective, like there's a 2.5 year like wait list for the local daycare center in my Austin, Texas suburb. That's just like a practical. Like, that's insane. It's kind of funny because I was in New York before I moved to Austin, and I always thought of like, it's crazy with private schools and super like interview centric daycare centers. But once you move to like the suburbs, everything's going to be great. Everything's going to be abundant. And so it's actually just not, which totally goes against what I think our actual expectations as society should be.
Yeah. So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
You've got one on the way. I have a 5-year-old, and I got to tell you, it's pretty great. It's actually, it's shocked me that my relationship with my daughter has become like the most important thing in my life. I never thought that would have been the case. So I'm happy for you, and you should be looking forward to it. It's really, really cool. But to your point about childcare availability, that happened to us. We applied to, I think, every single daycare possible where we live in Vermont, and we got into one. Thank God we got into the one. But it's so difficult, and it's such a huge anxiety driver and cost driver. My 5-year-old just started going to kindergarten, and it's such an enormous change in finances for us that now all of a sudden we don't spend $1,500 a month on childcare. That's a lot. And that's something that if we can bring down those costs, that's really going to help a lot of, just people trying to live their lives.
Something I'm curious about, I conflated 2021 to 2023 inflation with the high cost of living issue. These are slightly different issues though, right? Because I think the key thing to understand here, and this is why I don't want our political, because as you know, inflation is now down. Mm-hmm. I don't want a situation where we wake up in 2025 and basically, and this would be a problem on, let's say, the Democratic side of things, or Trump if he wins, to basically say, we dealt with that, it's all better now. The 2021 to 2023 inflation was totally different. We would have had these high cost of living issues even if that hadn't happened. So
yes,
can you
housing cost too much in housing cost too much in lots of places in 2019.
Yep.
Right. The childcare cost have been building for many, many years. As you say, the 2021 to 2023 is a distinct set of costs going up that is worth discussing and talking about. It just, as a guy who researches and teaches IPE, I talk about it in my classes. But it's, as you say, that's different from these broader costs going up. One of I know it's a podcast, so it's not a great medium for charts. But one of the charts that I think about a lot is this one that came out from AEI, and it looks at cost of different goods and services from 2000 to now they've updated to 2024. And it's things like hospital services and college going way, way up, daycare going way up, housing going up. Whereas stuff like TVs goes way down, cell phone services going way down. And so that's a chart about those long run cost increases and decreases. And that's totally larger than, and in many ways more important than, just that discrete 21 to 23. So I totally agree with your point on that. But that also means that, like, not only are we not off the hook, we actually have a challenge and a responsibility to get these policies right so that we're bringing down that long-term cost of living for people.
So let's focus on, and this is the key thing, everyone left, right, and center, no matter how extreme they are going to agree with the high cost of living issue. So that gets us then into what do you think won't work as an approach? And you specifically say price controls and demand subsidies will not be an effective response. And this is going to be the reflexive sort of left of center response to this. Articulate like why that is not the approach to someone who could agree with your diagnosis, but has a different solution.
Okay. So I think it's a totally fair question. So when we think about price controls, these are things that economists don't typically like because they basically add to shortages. So let's say that you've got a lot of rent control going on somewhere. You're going to cap the price of rent so that it can't go up. Well, what that ultimately does is it means that there's a lot less incentive for developers to build new housing in that area. So rent control is really great for a very particular kind of person. Someone who lives in an apartment, wants to rent it, wants to stay in it forever, never wants to leave. It's really bad for anybody who wants to move into that area, though, because now they can't find anywhere to live at all. Or the few places that aren't rent controlled skyrocket in cost. And so it's actually really bad for people who want to move to where the jobs are. Well, that's a lot of people who want to move to where the jobs are. And ultimately, you're creating a long-run shortage, and the shortage is the problem. And so just doing price controls, rent controls, they don't work. We've tried them before. Nixon tried them back in the early 70s. They don't work. His sort of instincts on the economy, people forget how bad Nixon was on the economy because of Watergate. It's totally taken over for understandable reasons. But he interfered in monetary policy. We didn't have Federal Reserve independence under him. And it touched off a lot of the inflation of the rest of the 1970s, his price controls and his interference in monetary policy. You can lay, not all of it, but we had oil price spikes and other stuff, but you can lay at least some of the inflation of the 70s at his feet. These policies, they don't work. And then if you're thinking about other things that sometimes people want to do, one that will happen a lot is just sort of blame corporations. And again, maybe that feels good. And in some areas of the economy, maybe we could do better antitrust enforcement.
There's been issues in the meat packing industry, for example.
Absolutely. For example, right? There was a great new report that just came out by the Farm Alliance, Basel Muserbosch, on basically all the power asymmetries in the agricultural sector and the way farmers are getting squeezed between buyers on the one hand, they're very concentrated, and the sellers of their inputs that are also super concentrated. So there are certain areas, the FTC also recently has made moves against non-compete contracts, which basically prevent workers from going to other businesses. There's some of that. I don't want to knock antitrust as this thing that's never appropriate. Sometimes it is, but you're not going to antitrust your way out of some of these problems. There's a housing shortage. That's not an antitrust problem, not really. If you're looking at the challenges around green energy, around childcare, those aren't really antitrust problems. And so that's not your main solution in some of these areas either. There's another set of solutions, which is just subsidized demand, which that's going to directly help some of the people who you're subsidizing, but it's not going to help the people you're not subsidizing. It costs a lot, and it's going to jack up prices for everybody, which doesn't help. And so, the way I think about demand subsidies, they're almost like making all of those kids in the musical chair game faster. It's okay, cool. You made everybody faster. You still have a shortage of chairs. And so the real thing to do is to make sure that we can build. And so that, we actually have this real abundance, and we actually really bring down the cost of living for everybody. That's the solution that actually works better than just subsidizing demand.
And we'll get into your actual approach in the 5 different areas your report highlights, but you refer to the approach then as supply side progressivism. What's interesting about this space, and I've talked to a couple of journalists who are interested in it recently, is we throw around all these different terms. Is supply side progressivism different from the abundance agenda? Or or is there a hierarchy? How should you understand these terms?
So there's trade-offs everywhere.
Because you use them both in the report, so I was curious.
No. This is a great question. There's trade-offs everywhere. I mean, I say this to my students all the time. It's there's no escaping trade-offs. Supply-side progressivism has a big advantage in that it's both very clear what you're getting at, which is that we're going to increase supply. We're going to build more of those chairs for everybody. The problem with supply-side progressivism is there's a certain audience that hears Reagan when they hear that, and they just immediately don't want to get on board with it. Because they're that's
supply side economics. This is
right.
Put in the market. Uber alles and everything
exactly. That's what they hear when you say that, and so that's the drawback to supply side progressivism. abundance agendas. I mean, I'll just be honest. I love the vibes of abundance agenda. That really speaks to me. But I've talked to enough people to know that that's actually not the common thing.
Thank you for saying this, because whenever I do abundance agenda episodes, everyone's like, love the vibes. I'm not quite sure I like the name. The unfortunate thing is that everyone who's in this space knows this reality, but it's hard to come up. No one has come up with a better term at this point.
Yeah. So this is why we in our Chamber of Progress report, we ultimately focused on cost of living, because if I go talk to regular people, that's what they care about. So I was the first in my family to go to college. I still have lots of very blue collar family and friends. And I sometimes will just talk to them about stuff because I want to hear what regular people outside of my academic bubble think. And abundance agenda, you say it to them and they're like, what? Whereas you're housing is too expensive. And have you seen grocery prices lately? They're banging the table. Yeah, that's what we want you guys, academics working on. And so that's the major advantage to talking about cost of living, is it's really getting at what regular people are concerned about.
So let's get to the last, actually, and one quick thing. You do this awesome case study for hearing aids over the past 20 years as a way of making the concepts and the ideas we're talking about really practical. Talk about how the incredible, I had no idea about this issue, especially because I'm 32 and don't worry about hearing aid issues yet. Talk about how the story of the incredible decrease in the cost of hearing aids should influence how we think about the ideas we're talking about today.
Okay. So hearing aids used to be really expensive. If you wanted hearing aids, you either had to scrimp and save forever, or you needed to be, if not rich, at least pretty affluent. You would go to an audiologist. They would sort of try to do everything by hand. It would take a bunch of different steps. They were often uncomfortable. They were pretty large. The acoustics weren't very good. And it was really expensive. And then a couple of things happened at once. First thing that happened was you get 3D printing. This is one of the areas that has been most revolutionized by 3D printing. That has reduced the production steps from 9 to 3. So that really helps. Because hearing aids are small, you can ship them really easily. And so you can make them in these centralized facilities. Tons of hearing aids now get made in Poland. And so then we just buy them, which is that helps bring those costs down, which helps. But also you get the Biden administration through the FTC, make them over the counter. So now you don't have to have a prescription for them. So that also increases competition in that. So those three things combined, the technological improvements, the globalization, and the regulatory reform, mean that you can now get a good set of hearing aids on Amazon for $7.99, which if you look at the cost of hearing aids versus the median wage at the time, hearing aid costs have fallen by 90% compared to where they were 20 years ago. And so now you don't need to be rich or affluent if you're getting older and having hearing problems to afford a good set of hearing aids. And in fact, and this is really cool, the newest Apple AirPods actually have a setting that's a hearing aid setting. And so you can actually turn those into hearing aids now. And it's kind of funny. That was a Biden administration regulatory change that created that, correct? Yep. And so now you have all these different kinds of hearing aids that are cheaper, that are smaller, that sound better, that work better, that are more comfortable, that, a lot of times you can't even see them now. So that kind of reduces stigma. So there's just a lot of different ways in which hearing aid costs have come down, and that's increased the supply of them. And so they're more available to older people who may not always have a lot of money. And so when we talk about the abundance agenda, this is the stuff we're talking about. We're not talking about this thing on the whiteboard behind me. We're talking about real people and the things that they want to buy to be able to live good lives. That's what this is about. And so that's why I started the report with this discussion, is because it's a really good example of what we're doing here.
So for the last section to tie everything together, you identify 5 areas of focus when it comes to high cost of living. I'd love for you to just go through all of them, but they are housing costs, energy and infrastructure, cost of raising kids, healthcare, and new technology, which is sort of illustrated by the 3D printing comment you made there. Love for you to just go through just the practical application of those broad areas.
Great. So if anybody wants to read this report, it's at bringcostsdown.org. Probably should have said that earlier, but if anybody's wanting to,
I'll cover that in the intro. You're covered.
Oh, cool. All right, great. So these 5 different areas, we picked housing because it's sort of the number one driver of cost of living, right? If you talk to people about what's costing them too much, it's housing. And so there we looked at zoning reform, things like the minimum lot sizes I talked about earlier. We also talked about sort of these new innovative housing types, things like mass timber, right? The first mass timber building in the United States wasn't until 2011, but it's this new technology where you cross-laminate timber, and it has equal strength to weight ratios as like concrete. And so you can build them much taller now. The new IBC code in 2021 lets you go up much taller with these. This is great for the environment. They sequester carbon. The kinds of small diameter trees we need to cull anyway for wildfires is what they use. And it's not just a Pacific Northwest thing. It has very like Oregon vibes, but like the new mass timber, the new headquarters of Walmart that opened later this year in Arkansas are mass timber. And so we talk about ways of unlocking that. We talk about how to make small modular homes cheaper via removing the chassis rule. We go through a whole bunch of different sort of almost like micro topics in housing. Then we look at energy and infrastructure because those bleed out into everything else. Like one of the major drivers of inflation in the 70s was energy cost too much. If you want to bring down cost, maybe not economy wide, but in many different areas, you're talking about energy and infrastructure. Also, people want to be able to get around. If they have better transportation options, that's going to help reduce their cost of living. In urban areas, if you've got more bike lanes and people can e-bike, that might help a 2-car household be a 1-car household. And that's going to be really helpful to their cost of living, right? And we also looked at healthcare because this is another one that people really worry about a lot for understandable reasons. And so there we talked about things like removing the cap on residencies. So right now, for Congress back in the late 1990s, put a cap on the number of residencies. And so what happens is there are actually people who have the smarts and the drive and the empathy to get through medical school. They want to be doctors, but there aren't enough residencies for them. So they're just pushed out of the system, and it creates a doctor shortage. And the other thing too is because of that cap, we've frozen the geographic distribution of doctors basically where they were in the late 90s. So the shortage is worst in the places that are growing fastest, which is like double bad. And so, why we go through a bunch of different topics like this. I use this as an example, but there are a bunch of others. We talk about childcare. We've hit this up earlier. And then we talk about inclusive future because some of these, maybe not coming around in the next 30 seconds kind of technologies, but on the horizon are worth thinking through. And how do we encourage them, facilitate them, promote them so that over the long term, we help bring down these costs and help people live well.
So for the last question, and this is why I think this is such an attractive agenda, because once again, not to overdunk on Medicare for all, but states have attempted to pass their own universal healthcare bills. They've failed even in very blue states. So there's a political limit there. But like at a practical level, if you're sort of a DSA activist, like you're basically offered this playbook that says everything's about what's happening in the federal government, which maybe if you have FDR style or LBJ style majorities is an option you have, but that's not an option you have here. What's cool about this abundance agenda is this is state, federal, and local. When it comes to all of these, like there's a state, federal, and local version of every single one of the different policy areas we've talked about here. So can you talk about the real useful mix of all three that folks, whether they're like a city councilor or like a metro councilor or a member of Congress or even a president, how should they think about like the real trifecta here?
Yeah. So I think it's got to be all three levels pulling together, right? Because this is a challenge that's affecting tons and tons of Americans. And I actually like to think of it more as an opportunity thing. So there are lots of policymakers at these three different levels. And like what I would say to them is like, you actually have the opportunity to help. You actually have the ability to do something that you can go to your constituents and say, this is what I'm doing to help you. And so if you're at that local level, tons of the housing problem is local. Zoning reform is a local thing. If you're a state level official, well, guess what? Tennessee has just passed a new law that's allowing trained and experienced doctors from abroad to come provide medical services in Tennessee. And there's 7 or 8 other states like Iowa, Idaho, Arizona, a couple others that are following their lead in doing that. That's a thing you can do at the state level. Lots of healthcare stuff is done at the state level. Healthcare telemedicine, in Virginia and Maryland, they now have reciprocity. So if you are a doctor you're some kind of medical provider in Maryland, you want to provide telemedicine services, you can do that in Virginia, right? Telemedicine and healthcare is a state thing. If you're thinking about federal, well, okay, there's all kinds of stuff in energy and infrastructure permitting reform, like we've seen this week. That's the thing Congress members can do, right? If you're the president, okay, you're the president. You can actually work on resolving the trade dispute between the United States and Canada on softwood lumber. Right now, we tax softwood lumber at 14%. That's crazy. We're taxing lumber during a housing shortage. That doesn't make any sense. There are other trade areas where you could see like semiconductors in China. You can understand a geopolitical national security kind of case to be made for domestic production. This is Canada. This is our neighbor and greatest ally. Let's just, and they're a softwood, heaven. Let's just import some lumber from Canada and make housing cheaper to build. That doesn't have those national security implications. Let's just do that. And that's something a president could do. And so what I would just say is policymakers at every level have the opportunity to be part of the solution. And then also go to their constituents and say, here's what I'm doing to be part of the solution.
That is an excellent place to end. Gary, this has been a great conversation. Can you just do one more shout out to where folks should go to learn more about this work?
This is bringcostdown.org. The paper is the Democratic Cost of Living Agenda, and I wrote it for Chamber of Progress.
Great. Gary, thank you for joining me on The Realignment.
Thank you.